Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. I'm Mark Laberton. Welcome to Conversing. Welcome to Conversing. This episode of Conversing is a special episode that gives us an opportunity to gather with several friends as we anticipate the inauguration of Donald Trump as our 47th president. For some, this day is one that's being anticipated with great hope and joy that at last this person that so many have wanted to see returned as president has been fully and duly elected and is beginning his term. For others, it's a day of anticipated anxiety and fearfulness because of the division and because of the difference in opinions between Republicans and Democrats on so many issues and between Donald Trump and so many people both inside the United States and around the world. The Bible exhorts us to pray for those who are in leadership. That means not just pray, but to consider, to think about, to weigh seriously those who are placed in leadership. And this is a conversation that's not about our partisanship, but really more about how do we pursue a common citizenship in which we think about how we can stimulate and encourage our healthy national life, not least in a time of such hostility and division and brokenness, inside the church and outside, as well as in culture and society in general. We're so glad to welcome today three very special guests. Ann Snyder Brooks is editor-in-chief of Comment Magazine, one of the sponsoring organizations of this very podcast. She oversees our partner project as well, called Breaking Ground, and is the host of what's called the Whole Person Revolution podcast. Secondly, I have the opportunity to welcome Pete Wehner. Pete has also been on Conversing before. He's a contributing writer at The Atlantic, a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times, a senior fellow at the Trinity Forum, and formerly a speechwriter for President George W. Bush. And David Emmanuel Goatley we welcome as well. He serves as the president of Fuller Theological Seminary, prior to which he had served as the Associate Dean for Academic Formation and as the director of the Office of Black Church Studies at Duke Divinity School. For more than 20 years, he had also served as the CEO of the Lot Carey Baptist Foreign Mission Society, where he led the organization's efforts to sustain mission partnerships all around the world. Ann, Pete, David, so glad you could join us today. Thank you very much for doing so.
Thanks for having us.
Great to be with you. Thanks, Mark.
Three of us had the opportunity to do this just before Election Day, and today having Ann in our midst is a great gift that will add another perspective and voice to the times that we're living in and to the state of our nation and the question of how people of Christian faith can lean into these challenging and difficult and frequently divided times. So to have each of your three voices is truly a great gift. I wonder if we could just start by just admitting a couple of things. One, we all hold our nation with great love, that we appreciate and value it enormously. And I think it might be nice if we could start with just however you want to express your commitment and affection, honor toward our nation. This is an important occasion. Any presidential inauguration is weight-bearing. How do you hold our nation at this time? What is it you would want to say and affirm about our national life?
Yeah, I would say that, my view of America is shaped by a number of things. One is that actually my parents were immigrants, so I'm first generation American. And so I grew up, in some respects, I would say seeing America through the eyes of an immigrant, which is sometimes different than it is from families that are natural born. And looking back, I had a view of America that was idealized, and I think actually in some ways mythologized, probably too much so. But it was a deep affection for what the country stood for, its founding ideals. As I grew older, it was a matter of coming to terms with the fact that the reality of the nation is often at odds with the ideals of what this nation is, which is the case for all nations. But it is in the history of nations a beacon. And so that affection is there. But of course, there are vicissitudes and ups and downs. And so sometimes you feel that your relationship to the nation is really shaped in part by what the moment in time is. And so I'd say that the love is enduring, but there are varying degrees of respect and honor and disappointment and unease. And that in any given lifetime, you can go through that cycle a lot of different times.
Right. Thank you. David?
I think I'd like to say two things about this in response to your question, Mark. Thanks for it. One is that I appreciate contributions, both nationally and globally, that the United States offers. There are many. We can talk about many positive contributions. The other thing is I'm the kind of patriot who is committed to the country being the best that it can be. Not the kind who says, whatever happens, you get a pass. And when you're in a family that is strong and loving, you rejoice in the things that rejoice. You weep with your siblings and family members, but you also try to hold them accountable to be the best version of themselves individually and the best versions of themselves family. And so I appreciate the positive. I'm a committed patriot that wants us to be the best that we can be, which also includes repentance, and it includes repair, and it includes a kind of patient listening and seeking to understand, and then leaning in to be as helpful as we can be with one another, especially to those who are most vulnerable to things that are beyond their control.
And how would you see it?
It's hard to improve on both of those, but the thing that keeps my love for America alive fundamentally is this sense that we are a rambunctious, unfolding still project, and one that really does invite everybody, whether we do so actually, and I think that remains sort of a long way to go, whether we really invite everyone into our sort of democratic experiment. But there's something in the feel of an experiment that remains true about us, even if there are many other democracies around the world. I think there's something probably in the spirit of the American people that lends itself to feeling like we have a chance to keep remolding and to shoot towards that repair and repentance that David just talked about. And so I think that there's a growth potential always, so my hope is never completely dashed. Mm-hmm. And then I think just specifically leading into a transfer of political power, I remember a number of years ago, I live about 10 blocks from the Capitol, and in 2021, the neighborhood in which I live in was heavily militarized because of what had occurred on January 6th in 2021, and there was a lot of nerves around, would there be more violence? Would there be more disruption, specifically on Inauguration Day? And regardless of who was coming into power, I remember walking the blocks around the Capitol building as far as you could get. At that time, you could really not get very far because of the zone of protection, which was a little unusual given what had occurred. And I just remember seeing like every tribe and tongue out to like taking photos and getting as close as they could be. And the sense of first fear, paralysis, oh no, is something terrible going to happen on this actual day? Or are we going to do what we historically have tried our best to do, which is hand a baton over? And there was something in that the surprise relief of peace of that day that filled me with a patriotism I did not expect. And so whatever that is, I hold that with hope.
Yeah. I think one of the things that really shaped my life and my understanding of our nation really was growing up in the Pacific Northwest it was a place of such extraordinary beauty and enormity of horizons and vistas. And it felt like not only the ocean itself, but the ocean of trees that defined so much of Western Washington and Puget Sound, and the mountains, the sets of spectacular mountains. So when we sang the national anthem, it was easy to attribute some of those images to the beauties that I was living around. And it was a very simple context. Our family had been in the Northwest for a long time, very strong sense of commitment to the land and to the place, and to my dad's sense of boyhood and how they had come, his family had come as an immigrant family to the Pacific Northwest. And it was, it gave me a sense, when it was combined with my dad's naval service and then later my brother's naval service, it was combined with this incredible sense of the strength and vitality that was born in nature, that also was born in many of the people that I knew, and then born particularly in my dad and my brother. And while I knew that it was a troubled country, and growing up during the 60s, I was intensely engaged in understanding and trying to see and perceive what was really going on in places. And that expanded manyfold as I became an adult. But it was really probably the seminal place where some of those fundamental sensibilities about society, culture, place, people, hard work, a vision of beauty, a vision of community that was connected, and also troubled in various ways in not being connected, having grown up adjacent to the Yakima Reservation. So there was just a lot that informed that. And I think that still is part of that deep pool of things that shape us. You know, none of us comes to this year's inauguration with the slightest hesitancy in acknowledging what a complicated and fraught day this is going to be as a symbol, at the very least. We hope not more than as a symbol, but as a symbol at least. The nation, we know, is contested and divided in various ways. The election of Donald Trump was highly contentious, though the majority of the nation voted for him, and the Democratic Party failed. It's a story that's still very much unfolding. We're not here to have a partisan conversation about that, but we are, I hope, here to talk realistically about how do we lean in at a time of commitment, need, urgency, of beauty, of courage, of integrity, of justice, to do the work of the kingdom of God, namely to reflect the character of a God of love and mercy and justice in the next 4 years. And I just wanted to take time for this conversation to have you reflect a bit on your own commitments as you think about the next 4 years. It's fraught. We have a sense that could easily reach very concerning levels, perhaps not. But whatever it is, how are you approaching this, and how are you trying to sustain in your own spirit nothing that paralyzes you, but actually find freedom and courage to engage what is really before us and to do it for the welfare of the nation and for particular people in the places that we serve. Each of you are in different kinds of contexts where your voices are really important. David, as a president of Theological Seminary, Pete, as a commentator and a leader of the Trinity Forum, and Anne as the editor of Comment Magazine. So take us with you as you sort of imagine the next 4 years unfurling, and what would you hope to be and or do that will be life-giving to the nation and to the people you care about?
Well, Mark, I'll answer by situating myself for perhaps those who are listening who don't know. I'm a Black man in the United States, and life has been difficult for a number of us for centuries. And so one of the interesting things for me is some of my siblings for whom their angst is new. And I'm happy to say, welcome to my world. But for believers, our confidence and our hope cannot be wrapped up in political or ideological rhetoric or reality. And we have to drink from a deeper and fresher well than that, which emboldens us to be people who are grounded in the gospel, for me, knowing that political questions are answers to how to get something done, but the ethical moral frame is what kind of people we should be, to continue to try to make the case, even when it seems that no one is responding. And so I think it's important for those of us who are believers and of people of goodwill to keep a moral, ethical grounding that seeks to make this world more humane and habitable for those who are the most vulnerable.
Thanks, David.
Yeah, I'll go next. That was beautifully said, David. Thanks for sharing that. You know, I'd say, Mark, in my position, and primarily as a writer and commenter on public affairs, but not only on public affairs, there's some uncertainty going into the next 4 years. And I think I'm trying not to prejudge the next 4 years. And as a writer, you know, sometimes you just let events unfold, and some of it is just intuition. It's what does a particular moment call, or what do you believe that is called for at that time? And so that is a kind of, you know, hopefully some measure of discernment or wisdom. As a general matter, I would say that, you know, I want to try and speak the truth as best that I see it in this moment. I feel like one of the great challenges to the country right now is this assault on truth, this epistemological chaos that we're in, and that there can be a tendency for people to accommodate themselves to lies, and I think we're seeing that to some measure. So I'd say that's part of it. Standing up for justice, I think, as we understand justice, especially for the dispossessed, the aliens, the powerless, to try and keep a spotlight on that and them and their story. And then to try and be, to the degree that I can, a healing force in the nation too. And those are sometimes, honestly, they feel somewhat at odds. Mm-hmm. I feel myself sometimes pulled kind of in different directions. And so I try and surround myself with people who can try and help me to sort through that, what is unfolding and what's needed at this moment. I'm very conscious of the Eugene Peterson formulation. There's the Jesus truth and the Jesus way. And it's easy to jettison the Jesus way when you convinced that you're, you know, a champion for the Jesus truth. So I think trying to keep that in balance is really important too. I'd say on an individual level, to try and lean into people's stories of all sides and all different persuasions, just to continue to become a better listener, to understand how people came to believe what they believe. And then one other thing I'd say is, you know, I think different people are called to be different things at different moments. We can't be all things. So I think some writers that I look to are more prophetic in their voice. Others are more toward trying to help deepen our understanding and trying to be forces of unity and binding up the wounds. And I think there's a place for both of those. And, you know, different people are cast in different vineyards to do different work. And so, as I said, a lot of it, I would say, is just a sense, an intuition, trying to figure out what is it that I feel, what can I give voice to, and how do I do it in a way that actually advances things, even imperfectly, that you think that honor Christ.
Right. Thanks, Pete. That's very helpful too.
That was really helpful, Pete, what you just said about not being all things. And I think especially those of us who are in the writing business or meaning making or trying to name reality as best we can, you just hit on something I've wondered, is it possible to be both in this era? And it requires a lot of discernment. And that is, like, is it possible to be both prophetic and a force of unity at the same time? And I think that's something I'm really struggling with, to be honest, heading into this sort of more uncertain period. Mark, to try to answer your question just briefly from where I sit, I think, and I say this both as a human being, as a citizen, but also as someone who's stewarding a space that's trying to enrich the public square with better questions. I find myself feeling emotion, like two things heading into this inauguration in the next number of years. And that is, one, I do feel like very curious, like more than I did 4 to 8 years ago, both curious sort of socially, about how some of our perhaps more assumptive tribes, I live in a creative class city, very highly educated, how will those kinds of worlds begin interacting, if any differently, sort of outside and beyond their own, maybe starting with different questions about their fellow citizens, not immediately seeing political preference as sort of an equation for an immediate equation for moral standing or like one's identity. I'm kind of curious if we will begin to approach one another with different kinds of slates, whether they're blank slates or just differently framed, or will we just, out of sheer exhaustion, and we're all living through, I think, turbulence in the globe. There's a lot of, some say there may be a World War III in the next decade. Both you and most primarily you, David, you're dealing with a huge natural disaster in Southern California. And like all these kinds of things are happening around us. And all of that is so taxing on the human spirit. And will we just out of inertia and all that, will we both kind of go further into ourselves and isolation and just try to cozy up with those whose moral and cultural notes sound the same as ours? Or will we figure out creative ways to kind of develop the resilience and often self-sacrificing energy to kind of stay in diverse relational contexts? Insofar as those of us who live in geographies where that's more possible, will we do that? So I'm very curious about that. I have actually hope around that because I feel like there's sort of been a great chastening that's visited itself upon the country as of November. But I also feel both curious and really concerned, I would say, about sort of our institutions. I do think there's something, and I'm not articulate about this yet, or maybe never be, but there's something interesting being broken open at this time. And as someone who cares a lot about the health of our large institutions and certainly governing ones, I have some sympathy once in a while for all those who are in kind of the reimagining conversation. It's sometimes it's like patience has run out, and there's an element where I think I have an ear for the argument like, well, someone's just going to come in and smash and burn them all and all of our establishment. And that's sort of interesting to me to watch what happens from that. But my major worry is I don't have a lot of confidence that just broadly in the public, and to be perfectly honest, in this coming administration, that there's like a lot of constructive rebuilding competence or rebuilding muscles. I think we've become such a critical society generally. So I worry that, to take a very raw example, I think right before the call you said you were talking to people who have lived in Altadena or Pacific Palisades who are just saying it's as if this never existed. It's as if the Palisades were never here. It's just been flattened. It's as if Altadena was never here. Will there be ground that we actually don't recognize anymore? And then what will we do? So I'm socially and humanly curious and strangely a little hopeful for new frames of how we are with one another, but I am steeling myself for turbulence and violence at a time when it feels like we can't afford those things because we have massive forces like AI, climate change, shrinking populations, lots of things that are kind of large that we can't fully control in our own lives happening. So it just seems like a funky time to feel like there is uncertainty at the top.
I'm Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me. One of the things that I'm struck by is that there's just such a heaviness in many different places where it's a fatigue, it's a fearfulness, and yet there's such an urgency for constructive action to actually move our nation forward because there's so much vulnerability. And today, as we're having this conversation, there are pieces of the global stage that are shifting, and a potential agreement on all of those who are hostages, and some kind of making of peace, or of at least of a period of peace between Israel and Palestine or Gaza. And so it's not only internal to the United States, but it's external to the United States as well. And the need for a deep compassion and energy and engagement that doesn't stop listening, that doesn't stop seeing, that doesn't stop caring, that just tries to kind of hide out in some burrow of our own individual making, where we can see and hear and feel as little as possible over the next 4 years, which would just be a total disaster, and especially a disaster to the life character of what the people of God in the Christian church are meant to demonstrate. So I guess to keep renewed, I've been reflecting, for example, on what are the things that just renew my mind, that renew my body, that give me a sense of rejuvenation. I'll just share a few, but then I'd like to invite you to share some of these as well. Definitely time outside, definitely time in the air, definitely unstructured time that feels as though it can be quiet, more present with family, more present with friends. It also comes out for me in the need for beauty in general, natural beauty for sure, for starters, but also artistic beauty. And I've been aware that just in the last several months that I'm increasing the amount of reading that I'm doing in some of those areas. And I'm anticipating and have already started going more frequently to some museums that I have at hand that I just don't spend enough time actually really attending to. These are things that don't have a direct impact on anything that I'm doing, but they do have a subliminal and mental impact. I've disciplined my way out of certain media contexts. I've stopped listening, stopped reading, stopped doing certain things, but have added in other things that I think are still very informative, but that are a different landscape and that hear and sound like different voices, and staying in community with people who are going to stay actively reflective about what's going on, but not obsessed. All of those things are kind of part of the juggling act for me of what encourages my energy, as well as just continued prayer and reflection on the God of the Bible, who never wearies of our story. And that just always encourages me. What are some of the things for any of you that feel like they are just energizing, strength building?
Yeah, I'll pick up on that, Mark, because sounds like sort of taking a page out of a lot of what you're doing. I think you're right in terms of, I found myself, turning off the news, not particularly because I'm just sort of tired of it. I think part of it was just the natural weariness of an election. This was a particularly ugly and petty campaign. So you want to get out of that. And it's just giving your sense a chance to breathe, your mind and your imagination very concretely. Cindy and I have found ourselves going to the National Gallery of Art. Part of it is because we're kind of empty nesters and we're a little freer to do that now. But it's to be intentional. So we want to go down. They have an impressionist exhibit at the National Gallery of Art through the end of January, just to see that and the beauty. Sometimes to go to concerts, to hike. The area that I live in, Northern Virginia, some beautiful places to hike 15, 20 minutes away. So I do think that the aesthetic side of our lives, the imaginative side of our lives through stories and books, and then a big part, and this has been true always throughout my life, I think I'm struck as I get older just about the centrality of just the relationships, just spending time with people, making time for people. Sometimes it's hosting couples for dinner. Sometimes it's meeting people for coffee or for lunch, just to learn more of these stories, to share yourself, to have others share their parts of their lives, to get perspectives of different things, being in book club, together and reading different books. It's an interesting thing because I think for most of us, not all of us, but for most of us, our day-to-day lives, even in the political realm, are not really driven primarily by what's happening with the presidency. It's what's happening with a governor or a mayor or a city council or school boards. There's something about the nature of the presidency and the especially now with social media and the amplification that we have, where I think we just sort of get pulled into that kind of thing. And so I do think one has to be intentional to try and move away from that space. But all of us know on some level that the most important parts of our lives are not the political parts of our lives. They're the relational parts and the imaginative parts, the areas of faith that help sustain a lot of us. And so I think if we just kind of recognize that and lean into what gives us energy and hope and encouragement and beauty, then that prepares us for difficult times, whether they're in the political realm or in other realms of life.
Well, I'm aware that we all have different mediums and different styles. And one that I didn't mention that has been something I also have been aware that I'm cultivating more is diversifying the music that I listen to and being fed by music that takes me places that other music doesn't, and that feels like it's a horizon that wakes me up to things and moves me. Sometimes it may be music that has themes related to the Christian faith, but very often it's other kinds of music as well. And being in a context where there's really a chance to be renewed by a different vision than the one that my little heart, mind, soul, and strength actually tends to live in most of the time, and to be stretched by a musician. John Batiste would be an example of somebody who I've admired for a long time, but especially in recent months with all of his work, I just find listening to him just takes me to a place that is really important, and I come away with a smile and with deep gratitude for whatever that little experience was all about, and the genius that God gave him and so many other people in music. Let me ask another question and then a final question. The first question I want to ask is, what would be your hope if we look back in 4 years and this period of this current presidential administration that's just about to be formally begun? What would you hope to be able to say about the last 4 years?
I would hope, this is perhaps specific to my vocational craft and domain, may not be a shared hope, but I do think this is a time for big books. And I also think it's a time for really healthy substantive arguments that are not ad hominem. So we'll see if that can be achieved in this era. But if you can cultivate a space, and it'll be interesting to see how new media interacts with this. I tend to think virtual means of debating tend to go sideways pretty quickly. So are there ways we can almost reinvent almost like a ancient form here again? But for better and for worse, I think people are right when they say we're in a post-civility era. And there's a lot of negatives to that. And I do think those of us who are naturally or dispositionally inclined to listen first, we may be shyer, we may just really, we yearn to be peacemakers, so we are shy away from conflict. We will tend to be drowned out, I think, in the next number of years, at least in the broader public domain. However, I think sometimes the sort of idolatry of civility in certain circles over the last 10 years or so has not allowed the prophetic or the sort of sharply artistic or the sort of gritty edge of moral arguments to be robust. And so I do somehow, I think part of my mindset is, what are the conditions that I could help create, and a lot of people out there could also help create in intimate settings and broader settings, where we can relearn how to disagree and clarify why the priors feel so sometimes bizarrely different. And I think there might actually be something surprisingly humanizing in that process. So I would love to see that happen in a healthy way and see a younger generation that may recover a delight actually in, debating the right kinds of things, whether that's what kind of community do we want as a nation, or, finding the right questions that are worthy of a bit of a good fight. I would love to see that happen.
Yeah, that's great.
I think perhaps related to what Anne said is, I hope that there are people whose weariness of the polarization within faith communities and in society more broadly, that the weariness of that will stir up a commitment to try to work to transform conflict, to perhaps stir up in people a spirit of making peace, which will require the kinds of conversations that Ann talked about. And I was talking with someone recently, and I really appreciated the person talking about determining what container you come into the conversation with. Is the container one of dialogue, where you're seeking to understand each other? Or is it the container of debate, where you need to define the differences clearly? And you can do that without killing each other. So as we get to the end of this, my hope is that in some ways the Lord will help us to redeem the time and respond to a weariness of the spirit of combat with the spirit of transforming conflict. And that doesn't mean everybody is always going to be on the same note, but at least maybe we can learn how to be polyrhythmic and have a kind of a polyharmonic rather than feeling like it always has to be a clash. So that's what I hope for in the coming years.
That's great. Pete.
Yeah, just very, very quickly, and to build on what both Ann and David said, sometimes viruses create their own antibodies, and I'm hoping that these antibodies, civic antibodies, faith antibodies, are going to be generated. And, sometimes in the life of an individual, like in the life of a nation, there are certain qualities, certain virtues, certain characteristics that you take for granted. And you don't realize why they were important until you're stripped of them. And then you're reminded why they actually do matter. And, I'm not a Pollyanna here. I don't think this is a good moment for the country. And I think we're going into some dangerous water. So I think my hope is the capacity for regeneration and renewal, and that there is a kind of catalytic effect toward what really leads to human flourishing and away from dehumanization and deeper understanding. And then I suppose more narrowly, in terms of the Christian faith, I think there's a lot of wreckage out there, quite honestly, and things have been exposed. I think it's the last decade and more. It's not specific to this decade, but I think it's been particularly amplified, that it's been a kind of CAT scan on a lot of things. And I think something has gone deeply wrong in large parts of the white evangelical world, Christianity more broadly. And I think it's important to name that and to know that, rather than to stumble along in ignorance. But having identified it, then to do something about it. I suppose if you use the language, which is somewhat in vogue these days, about deconstruction, I'm completely fine with deconstruction as long as there's reconstruction, as long as it doesn't deconstruct for its own sake, and that's where it stays. Mm-hmm. And so I hope, in terms of faith in the larger American community, if there is such a thing, that there will be a kind of deconstruction and reconstruction that ultimately leads us to a better and more beautiful place. There's a great line that the ancient Greeks used, and Bobby Kennedy used that in a speech of his in the late 60s, where he said that the task was to tame the savageness of man and to make gentle the life of this world. So I remember the first time I heard that, and I thought, that's a beautiful sentiment. And I think taming savageness and making gentle the life of this world, if we can find ways to reclaim that'd be a lovely thing.
I love what you've each just shared. It's just a few days now, and we will have President Donald Trump inaugurated. And the scriptures, as you know, exhort us to pray for our leaders. So in closing, I'd like us to just take a moment to consider, how do we intend to pray for Donald Trump? And what would be some of the things that we would want to lift up and indirectly encourage those who are listening to this to at least consider being part of their own prayers for the president and other leaders of our nation at all levels?
I think it'd be helpful for us to pray that the Spirit of God would overshadow the president and all those in power and anoint and envelop so that God's will be done. And there are times where, again, political, sociological, ideological things help us know what we want, but we can only see so far, any of us. And if we're going to pray like Jesus taught us to pray, we want not our will, but thy will be done.
It's a beautiful way of putting it, David.
I feel this is a beautiful thing for Pete to end on, so I'll go in the middle here. I love what you just said, David. That was very humbling, the way you just said that for me to hear. I think because my basic understanding of government is that it exists in a broken world to deal with injustice and also to maintain order. And I may have my doubts about this incoming administration and their ability to do that, but I will be praying towards those ends. And I would just pray for moral sensitization, and if not in the tippy top leader, in some broader web around that leader, and that our institutions would hold to maintain a sense of their sort of core reason for being, and certainly in the governing standpoint, protecting. So yeah, the simple phrase is moral sensitivity. I would pray for that.
That's beautifully put by both of you. And it's a great question, Mark. And it's not always an easy one, especially if you have strong feelings, if you think someone is doing things to hurt others. It's not just with political leaders. We face this also in our everyday life. And I think it's important to be able to name that honestly and not to pretend that these things are easier than they sometimes are.
Right.
But we are called to pray for leaders. And Donald Trump, whether he's president, which he is, but even if he weren't, that's the nature of our faith and what we're called to do. I would say in terms of his role as president, for wisdom and for a sense of justice, people caring about justice, that he be surrounded by people who are wise, that'll encourage him to do the right thing, or at least would prevent him from doing the wrong thing. And that if it goes into a bad path, that the wounds of the nation would be limited and mitigated. And then I would say for him, I mean, I'll just be candid here. I have a sense that he is a person with a lot of brokenness in his life. I think all of us, I'm sure all of us have brokenness in our lives. We are all works in progress, and there are family of origins issues and things that have happened that have shaped us and brought us to tears and created all sorts of effects and defense mechanisms within us. We all have that. I don't think that we, and I don't think I think often enough of him as a person who's actually faced something in his life that has turned him the way he is. Sometimes you can get focused on the manifestation of those things, and that matters, especially if you're president, because you affect a lot of lives. But just as an individual life, what is that journey that he has been on? And of course, you don't bet on these things, and he's a person almost 80 years old, so he's very much set in his ways. I mean, on the other hand, the most powerful stories, are always the stories of an about face, of some kind of change, which can be powerful for an individual and powerful for people who know that individual and witness. Do I expect that to happen? No. Is it possible? Yes. But I think out of faithfulness, we're called to do it. And just the last thing I'll say, Mark, just more broadly about it's kind of how we view this, I think, people as people of faith. And the way I think I've come to understand even my own journey in life, especially at the times of suffering or the times of struggle, it is a deep sense, and you've been one of the people who've helped me to see this, and others have too, that we're part of a story, and there's an author, and there's a beginning and a middle and an end. And when you're in the middle of that story, you don't know how it's going to unfold. And within that story, there are difficult chapters, and you shouldn't ever pretend that they're not less difficult than they are. But those chapters aren't the whole story. And I do think that the four of us as followers of Jesus, as people of faith, on some deep level have this belief that there's a purpose to this and that there's an author to this. And, that we're citizens of a city that men and women didn't build and can't destroy, and which is everlasting. And that isn't just pretty language. It's actually a frame and a hope in the deepest sense of the reality of things. I think if we hold those things in mind, and I don't hold them in mind often enough, I think that they just help us to create shock absorbers through the journey.
Wow, those are really great encouragements for how to think about how to pray for our president. There's undoubtedly stories of all the people who are listening to this who will be seeking to discover their own ways in which those prayers can be offered. But thank you all three for being on this call and for the opportunity to just benefit from your perspective and your gifts and your own social location. So I feel as though we are beginning a chapter that will be, it feels potentially a notorious chapter in American history. And I'm hoping that in addition to its notoriousness, that it will also be a time where all people in power are led into deeper personal healing, and that all people who are in power are people who are going to seek to lay down as much of that power as possible, particularly for the sake of the most vulnerable. And how that actually gets exercised is one of the great challenges we have as a nation, as well as we inaugurate another president. Thank you all very much for being part of this conversation.
Thanks so much, Mark. Great being with you, David and Ann.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. It's good to be with all of you.
Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. Peter Laberton is our engineer and editor. Evan Rosa is our producer. For more information about Comment Magazine, visit comment.org, where you can subscribe, read the current magazine issue, and browse their archive. Fuller Seminary is an evangelical, multi-denominational graduate institution committed to providing indispensable formational education for diverse Christian leaders everywhere. For information, visit fuller.edu. I'm your host, Mark Laberton. Thanks for listening with me.